What would you do if you witnessed someone being cornered by a group of aggressive strangers? Would you intervene, call for help, or assume someone else would handle it? Most people freeze in moments like these, but what happened in a small-town diner during a quiet Tuesday lunch hour proves that appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. Sarah Martinez looked like any other 28-year-old woman enjoying her lunch break, petite, quiet, and completely unassuming as she sat alone in the corner booth of Murphy's Diner. The three men who decided to make her their target that day had no idea they were about to learn a lesson that would change their lives forever. They saw what they thought was an easy victim. What they got was 30 seconds of education they'd never forget. This is the true story of how a moment of predatory behavior turned into a masterclass in self-defense, and why you should never judge someone's capabilities by their appearance. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you'd least expect. Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who preferred to blend into the background. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she moved through the world with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for shyness. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she favored comfortable jeans and plain t-shirts over anything that might draw attention. To the casual observer, Sarah looked like 1,000 other young women you might pass on the street without a second glance. What people didn't see was the way her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings, cataloging exits and assessing potential threats with the precision of someone trained to survive in hostile environments. They didn't notice how she positioned herself with her back to walls whenever possible, or how her hands, though small and seemingly delicate, bore the calluses and small scars that came from years of intensive training. Sarah Martinez was not what she appeared to be, and she preferred it that way. The small town of Cedar Falls had been her home for exactly 18 months, ever since she decided to leave her old life behind and start fresh. After 8 years in the Navy SEALs, including 3 combat deployments and more classified missions than she could count, Sarah had earned the right to disappear into civilian life. The transition hadn't been easy. It never was for people with her background, but Cedar Falls offered something she'd never had before: anonymity. She'd taken a job as a freelance graphic designer, work she could do from her small apartment above the old bookstore on Main Street. The pay was modest, but it was honest work that let her sleep at night without wondering if she'd wake up to enemy fire. Most days, she barely spoke to anyone except Mrs. Chun, who owned the bookstore below, and the handful of regular customers at Murphy's Diner, where she'd taken to eating lunch 3 times a week. Murphy's Diner was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in a town like Cedar Falls. Red vinyl booths that had seen better days, a checkerboard floor that showed every scuff mark, and the persistent smell of coffee and bacon grease that had seeped into the walls over decades. The owner, Frank Murphy, was a Vietnam veteran in his 70s who ran the place with his wife, Dolores. They served simple food prepared well, and they didn't ask too many questions about their customers' lives. It was exactly what Sarah needed. On the Tuesday that changed everything, Sarah had arrived at Murphy's at exactly 12:15, just like she did every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. She'd chosen her usual booth in the back corner, the one that gave her a clear view of both the front door and the kitchen entrance. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits had kept her alive in places where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between going home and going home in a box. Dolores had brought her the usual without being asked: a turkey sandwich on wheat bread, no mayo, with a side of fruit instead of fries, and black coffee. Sarah had been working on a logo design for a local veterinarian's office, her laptop open on the table beside her barely touched lunch. The work was engaging enough to occupy her conscious mind, but her subconscious remained alert, processing the familiar rhythm of the diner's Tuesday afternoon crowd. The lunch rush had ended an hour earlier, leaving only a handful of customers scattered throughout the restaurant. There was old Mr. Peterson reading his newspaper in his usual spot by the window, 2 construction workers sharing coffee and complaining about their foreman, and a young mother trying to convince her toddler to eat his grilled cheese. Normal people living normal lives, the kind of peaceful scene that Sarah had once dreamed about during long, dark nights in Afghanistan and Iraq. She'd been in Cedar Falls long enough to recognize most of the regular faces, which was why she immediately noticed the three men who walked through the front door at exactly 12:45. They weren't locals. Everything about them screamed outsiders, from their expensive clothes that didn't quite fit the small-town aesthetic to the way they moved with the aggressive swagger of men who were used to getting their way through intimidation. The first man was clearly the leader, tall and broad-shouldered with prematurely gray hair and the kind of expensive watch that cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a month. His companions were younger, probably in their late 20s, both built like men who spent serious time in the gym, but had never learned to use their strength for anything more constructive than bullying people smaller than themselves. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her brain cataloging details with the efficiency of a computer program. The leader had a slight bulge under his left armpit, shoulder holster, probably a compact pistol. One of the younger men had a knife clipped to his right pocket, visible if you knew what to look for. The third man kept his right hand in his jacket pocket, fingers wrapped around something he clearly thought gave him an advantage. They weren't here for the food. Sarah could tell that much from the way they surveyed the diner like predators looking for prey. Their eyes swept over Mr. Peterson, dismissed the construction workers as too risky, lingered for a moment on the young mother before apparently deciding she was too public. Then their attention settled on Sarah, sitting alone in the back corner with her laptop and her untouched sandwich. In that moment, Sarah faced a choice that every person with her background eventually confronted in civilian life. She could reveal who she really was, or she could continue to play the role of the quiet, unassuming woman that the people of Cedar Falls knew her to be. The smart move would be to close her laptop, pay her check, and leave through the kitchen entrance before things escalated. She had no obligation to these people, no mission to complete, no orders to follow. But as the three men started walking toward her table with the confident stride of predators who had never encountered real resistance, Sarah realized that some habits run deeper than training. Some instincts are burned into your soul by years of standing between evil and innocent people who can't protect themselves. The woman these men saw sitting in the corner booth might look like an easy target, but they had no idea that they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. Frank Murphy looked up from behind the counter where he'd been cleaning glasses, his weathered face creasing with concern as he watched the three strangers approach his quietest customer. In his 73 years, including 2 tours in Vietnam, Frank had developed a sixth sense for trouble. These men brought trouble with them like a storm brings rain. Dolores emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee, stopping mid-step when she saw what was happening. Her maternal instincts screamed at her to intervene, to protect the sweet young woman who always said please and thank you and never caused any trouble. But something in Sarah's posture, the way she'd gone perfectly still while continuing to type on her laptop, made Dolores hesitate. The construction workers had gone quiet, their conversation dying as they sensed the shift in the diner's atmosphere. Even the toddler seemed to pick up on the tension, stopping his fussy eating to stare with wide eyes. Mr. Peterson looked up from his newspaper, his hand instinctively moving toward the cell phone in his shirt pocket. Sarah saved her work and closed her laptop with deliberate precision, her movements calm and controlled despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. She'd been in this situation before, outnumbered, surrounded with civilians nearby who could be hurt if things went wrong. The difference was that this time, she wasn't wearing body armor or carrying an assault rifle. This time, she had only her training, her experience, and the element of surprise. The three men reached her table, arranging themselves in a semicircle that blocked her exit route toward the front door. The leader slid into the booth across from her without invitation, his expensive cologne failing to mask the smell of alcohol and cigarettes that clung to his clothes. His companions remained standing, looming over the table like monuments to bad intentions. Well, the leader said, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that predators use to lower their victim's guard. What do we have here? All alone, sweetheart? That's not safe for a pretty little thing like you. Sarah looked up from her closed laptop, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that held no fear, no submission, no invitation for whatever game he thought he was playing. In that moment, something in her expression should have warned him that he was making a mistake. Should have told him that the woman sitting across from him had looked into the eyes of killers before and walked away while they stayed behind in shallow graves. But men like these had spent their lives relying on size and intimidation. They'd never learned to read the subtle signs that separate sheep from sheepdogs, victims from warriors. They saw what they wanted to see: a small woman, alone and vulnerable, ripe for whatever twisted entertainment they had in mind. "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm just finishing my lunch." The leader laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Oh, but we insist on keeping you company. It's not every day we find such a pretty little bird all by herself. Maybe you could show us around town later? We're new here, and we'd love a personal tour." One of his companions snickered at the obvious innuendo, his hand moving to rest on Sarah's shoulder. It was meant to be a gesture of dominance, a way to establish physical control and demonstrate that she had no choice in whatever was about to happen. What the man didn't expect was for that seemingly delicate shoulder to be made of what felt like steel cable wrapped in silk. What he couldn't have known was that the woman he was trying to intimidate had survived hand-to-hand combat with trained killers in 3 different countries. What none of them understood was that they had just crossed a line that would change their lives forever. Sarah looked at the hand on her shoulder, then back at the man's face. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but something in her eyes had shifted. The construction workers later told police they couldn't explain what they'd seen in that moment, only that they suddenly understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. "I need you to remove your hand," Sarah said quietly, her words carrying no threat, no anger, just a simple statement of fact. The man's grip tightened instead. "Or what, princess? What are you going to do about it?" That's when Sarah smiled. Not the nervous, placating smile that victims give their tormentors, but the cold, calculating smile of a predator who has just been given permission to reveal her true nature. 30 seconds, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all this is going to take." The transformation was so quick and so complete that later, when the witnesses tried to describe what they'd seen, most of them struggled to find the right words. One moment, Sarah Martinez was the quiet woman who ordered the same lunch 3 times a week and never bothered anyone. The next moment, she was something else entirely, something that moved with lethal precision and struck with the efficiency of a machine built for war. It started with the man's hand on her shoulder. In one fluid motion, Sarah reached up and grabbed his wrist, her thumb finding the pressure point between the 2 bones of his forearm. The technique was called a compliance hold in her training manuals, but that clinical term didn't capture the immediate, overwhelming pain that shot through the man's arm like lightning. His fingers opened involuntarily, releasing their grip on her shoulder as his nervous system responded to a pressure that his brain interpreted as tissue damage. Before he could process what was happening, Sarah twisted his wrist in a direction that human joints were never designed to move. The sound of cartilage popping was audible throughout the diner, followed immediately by a scream that made Mr. Peterson drop his newspaper and caused the young mother to pull her child closer. The man tried to pull away, but Sarah held his wrist in what martial artists call a gift wrap, a position that gave her complete control over his balance and movement. A simple twist of her grip sent him stumbling sideways into the booth behind them, his face white with pain and shock. The leader started to stand, his hand moving toward the bulge under his jacket, but Sarah was already in motion. Years of close-quarters combat training had taught her to move through fights like a dancer moves through choreography, every movement flowing naturally into the next, no wasted motion, no hesitation. She pivoted in her seat and drove the heel of her palm upward into the leader's solar plexus. The strike looked almost gentle from a distance, but It carried the full force of her body weight multiplied by precise technique. The man's diaphragm spasmed, cutting off his breath and sending him crashing back in his seat, gasping like a fish out of water. The third man, the one who'd kept his hand in his jacket pocket, finally decided to reveal what he'd been hiding. He pulled out a switchblade, the kind of cheap intimidation tool that impressed civilians, but meant nothing to someone who'd faced Taliban fighters armed with assault rifles and rocket launchers. Sarah assessed the blade in the fraction of a second it took him to extend it toward her. 6-inch steel, probably not well-maintained, held by someone who'd likely never used it for anything more serious than opening packages. She'd learned knife fighting from instructors who'd studied under Filipino masters, men who treated bladed weapons like extensions of their own bodies. The man with the knife thought he had the advantage. He was bigger, stronger, and armed while she appeared to have nothing but her bare hands. What he didn't understand was that in close-quarters combat, especially in the confined space of a diner booth, size and strength mattered less than speed, technique, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. Sarah slid out of the booth with the liquid grace of someone whose body had been conditioned by years of physical training that most people couldn't imagine surviving. The knife wielder stepped forward, probably intending to use his reach advantage to keep her at a distance while he figured out what to do next. Instead, Sarah stepped inside his guard, moving so close that the knife became useless. She grabbed his wrist with both hands, controlling the weapon while driving her knee upward into his solar plexus. The impact folded him over like a closing jackknife, and Sarah used his forward momentum to twist his arm behind his back in a move that put enormous pressure on his shoulder joint. The knife clattered to the floor as his fingers opened reflexively. Sarah kicked it under a nearby table, removing it from play while maintaining her grip on the man's arm. A slight adjustment of pressure would dislocate his shoulder completely, and they both knew it. 22 seconds had elapsed since the first man had put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. The entire diner had gone silent, except for the labored breathing of the three men and the soft jazz music that continued playing from the speakers above the counter. Frank Murphy stood behind the register with his mouth slightly open, a dish rag forgotten in his hands. Dolores had set down her coffee pot and was reaching for the phone to call the police, though she wasn't entirely sure what she would tell them. The construction workers had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business and were openly staring at the scene unfolding in the back corner. The young mother had her phone out and was recording everything, though she'd later admit that she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to document what was happening. Sarah looked around the diner, taking in the shocked faces and the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. These people knew her as the quiet graphic designer who kept to herself and never caused trouble. Now they were seeing a side of her that she'd hoped to keep buried forever. The leader was still struggling to catch his breath, his expensive suit rumpled, and his face red from the lack of oxygen. The first man was cradling his injured wrist against his chest, tears streaming down his face from the pain. The knife wielder was frozen in place, afraid to move, because he could feel how little pressure would take to permanently damage his shoulder. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice calm and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You seem to have mistaken me for someone who would be intimidated by your little display. Let me clear that up for you." She released the man with the injured shoulder, but remained close enough to neutralize him again, if necessary. He stumbled backward, putting distance between himself and this woman who had just dismantled 3 grown men with the efficiency of a professional. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she continued, her eyes moving from one man to the next. "Former Navy SEAL, 3 combat deployments, specialized in close-quarters combat and hostage rescue. I've killed men twice your size with my bare hands, and I've done it in situations a lot more challenging than a small-town diner." The leader had finally caught his breath enough to speak, though his voice came out as more of a wheeze. "You can't, this is assault." Sarah tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be both innocent and terrifying. Actually, under the laws of this state, I was defending myself against 3 men who surrounded me, blocked my escape route, made threatening statements, and initiated unwanted physical contact. Any security camera in here will show that you approached me, not the other way around." She gestured toward the corner of the diner where a small security camera was mounted near the ceiling. "Frank keeps those cameras running 24/7, don't you, Frank?" Frank Murphy nodded slowly, still trying to process what he'd just witnessed. "Every second gets recorded," he confirmed, his voice rough with amazement. "Been that way since we got robbed 5 years ago." The man with the injured wrist was looking around the diner as if seeing it for the first time. The faces staring back at him held no sympathy, no support for his position. He was beginning to understand that he and his companions had seriously misjudged the situation. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her tone conversational, but carrying an underlying authority that came from years of commanding respect in life-or-death situations. "You're going to walk out that door, get in whatever vehicle brought you to Cedar Falls, and you're going to leave. You're not going to file any complaints, you're not going to cause any trouble for these good people, and you're certainly not going to come back here looking for revenge." The leader started to object, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," she said, and something in her voice made him close his mouth immediately. "You see, the thing about small towns is that everyone knows everyone else's business. By tomorrow morning, half the county will know that 3 tough guys got their asses handed to them by a woman who weighs less than any one of you. That's the kind of story that tends to follow people around." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "But if you leave now and never come back, maybe we can keep this between the people in this room. Maybe you can salvage what's left of your dignity and go find some other place to be the big fish in a small pond." The third man, the one who tried to use the knife, was nodding eagerly. He'd gotten a message loud and clear. "We'll go," he said quickly. "We don't want any trouble." "You should have thought of that before you decided to corner a woman during her lunch," Sarah replied. "But, yes, leaving is definitely your best option right now." The leader struggled to his feet, his face a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and barely contained rage. Men like him weren't used to being embarrassed, especially not by women, especially not in front of witnesses. But he was also smart enough to recognize that he'd encountered something outside his experience, something that could make his life very difficult if he pushed too hard. "This isn't over," he said, though the words came out with less conviction than he'd probably intended. Sarah smiled, that same cold smile she'd worn just before the confrontation began. "Oh, but it is. You see, I know exactly who you are now. I've memorized your faces, your builds, your mannerisms. I can describe you to police in 3 different states with enough detail for them to identify you in a lineup. And trust me, I have friends in law enforcement who would be very interested to hear about men who travel around intimidating women in small towns." The implication hung in the air like smoke. These men had clearly done this before, in other places, to other women who hadn't been able to defend themselves. But now they'd encountered someone who could not only protect herself, but also make sure they faced consequences for their past actions. The man with the injured wrist had heard enough. He was already moving toward the door, cradling his damaged hand, and clearly wanting nothing more than to put distance between himself and the woman who had just redefined his understanding of what was possible. His companions followed, the leader casting one last look over his shoulder as if memorizing Sarah's face. But there was no real threat in his expression anymore, just the hollow bravado of a man who'd learned that the world contained things he didn't understand and couldn't control. The diner door chimed softly as they left, the same pleasant sound it had made when they'd entered just a few minutes earlier. But everything had changed in those few minutes. The woman sitting in the back corner booth was no longer the quiet graphic designer that Cedar Falls thought they knew. She was someone else entirely, someone who carried skills and experiences that belonged to a different world. Sarah sat back down in her booth, reopened her laptop, and calmly resumed working on the veterinarian's logo as if nothing had happened. But She could feel the weight of a dozen stares, could sense the questions that everyone wanted to ask, but didn't quite know how to voice. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before Frank Murphy cleared his throat and walked over to her table. His weathered face was creased with something that might have been respect or amazement, or perhaps a little bit of both. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." Frank Murphy had seen combat before. 2 tours in Vietnam had shown him what human beings were capable of when pushed to their limits, but what he just witnessed in his own diner was something different. This wasn't the desperate violence of scared soldiers fighting for their lives. This was controlled, professional, and executed with the kind of precision that only came from extensive training and real-world experience. He pulled out the chair across from Sarah's booth and sat down heavily, his knees protesting the movement. At 73, Frank had earned the right to move slowly, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He'd spent the last 18 months watching Sarah Martinez eat lunch in his diner, making small talk about the weather and the town gossip, never suspecting that the quiet young woman was carrying secrets that would put most action movies to shame. "Navy SEAL," Frank said, not quite making a question. "I didn't know they allowed women in the SEALs." Sarah saved her work again and looked up from her laptop. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind the familiar weight of exhaustion that always followed combat situations. Even brief encounters like this one took their toll, reminding her body and mind of stresses she'd hoped to leave behind. "They don't, officially," she replied, her voice quiet enough that the other customers couldn't overhear. "But there are programs you won't find in any recruitment brochures. Special assignments for people with particular skill sets. The kind of things that happen off the books." Frank nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, but the practical needs of modern warfare often required creative solutions to complex problems. If someone had proven they could handle the training and the missions, he doubted that gender would stop the people who made the real decisions. 3 deployments, he said, remembering what she'd told her attackers. "Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places that don't officially exist on any maps," Sarah confirmed. "Places where the situations were too sensitive for regular military operations, but too important to ignore." Dolores had been listening from behind the counter, her maternal instincts warring with her curiosity. She approached the table carrying a fresh cup of coffee and the kind of concerned expression that made her look exactly like everyone's favorite grandmother. "Honey," she said, setting the coffee down in front of Sarah. "Are you okay? Did those men hurt you?" Sarah looked up at the older woman's worried face and felt something twist in her chest. This was why she'd come to Cedar Falls, why she tried so hard to disappear into a normal life. These people cared about her not because of what she could do or what she'd accomplished, but simply because she was part of their community. It was a kind of acceptance she'd never experienced in her previous life. "I'm fine, Mrs. Murphy. Thank you for asking." Dolores sat down next to her husband, clearly not satisfied with the brief answer. Those men were planning something awful, weren't they? I could see it in their eyes when they walked in here. Sarah nodded. She'd seen that look too many times to mistake it for anything else. They were predators looking for easy prey. Unfortunately for them, they picked the wrong target. The construction workers had given up any pretense of minding their own business and had moved to a table closer to Sarah's booth. The larger of the two, a man named Mike Rodriguez who'd been working construction in Cedar Falls for 15 years, leaned forward with unconcealed amazement. "Lady, I've seen some serious fights in my time, but what you just did was like something out of a movie. How did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. She'd spent months crafting a backstory for her civilian life, a simple narrative that would satisfy casual curiosity without revealing anything classified. But after what had just happened, those carefully constructed lies seemed inadequate. "The military teaches you things," she said finally. "When your job involves going into dangerous places and bringing people home, you learn whatever skills you need to survive." Must have been some serious training, the other construction worker, Tommy Chun, observed. Mrs. Chin's nephew had been working construction to pay for college and had grown up hearing stories about his aunt's mysterious tenant. Those guys were big, and they had weapons. You took them apart like they were made of paper. Sarah sipped her coffee, buying time to think. She'd hoped to keep her past buried, but the events of the last few minutes had made that impossible. The question now was how much truth she was willing to reveal. The thing about real combat training, she said slowly, is that it's not about being bigger or stronger than your opponent. It's about understanding leverage, timing, and anatomy. If you know exactly where and how to apply pressure, size doesn't matter nearly as much as most people think. Mr. Peterson had abandoned his newspaper entirely and was listening with the fascination of someone hearing about a world he'd only seen in movies. "Were you really in Afghanistan?" he asked. "Among other places," Sarah confirmed. "I spent 8 years doing jobs that most people don't know exist. Things that require a particular skill set." Frank leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. "What kind of jobs?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions she'd been avoiding for months. Finally, she looked up and met Frank's eyes. "Hostage rescue, counterterrorism, elimination of high-value targets. The kind of missions where failure isn't an option because too many lives depend on success." The diner had gone completely silent. Even the young mother with the toddler had stopped trying to coax her child to eat and was listening to every word. These people had thought they knew Sarah Martinez, the quiet graphic designer who paid her rent on time and never caused trouble. Now they were learning that their neighbor had lived a life that belonged in spy novels. "Elimination," Dolores repeated softly. "You mean, I did what needed to be done to protect innocent people and complete the mission," Sarah said simply. "Sometimes that meant killing people who were trying to kill others. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's not something I regret either." The honesty of her answer seemed to resonate with Frank, whose own military experience had taught him that combat wasn't glorious or exciting. It was necessary work done by people willing to carry the weight of difficult decisions. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Because after 8 years of living in a world where violence was always just around the corner, I wanted to see if I could find something else. I wanted to know what it felt like to go to sleep without checking for threats, to eat a meal without mapping escape routes, to have conversations with people who didn't carry weapons for a living." "And did you find it?" Dolores asked gently. "I thought I had," Sarah replied. "For 18 months, I've been just another resident of Cedar Falls. I've designed logos and business cards, paid my taxes, gossiped with Mrs. Chun about her garden. I was starting to believe I could really leave that other life behind." Tommy Chin shook his head in amazement. "But you can't, can you? After what just happened." "After what just happened, everyone in town is going to know that the quiet woman in apartment 2B isn't who they thought she was," Sarah said. "Small towns don't keep secrets very well." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Frank observed. "Those men who came in here today, they've probably done this before. Targeted women they thought couldn't fight back. They picked the wrong woman today, and maybe that'll make them think twice before they try it again." Mike Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "Damn right. Pardon my language, Mrs. Murphy, but the world needs more women like Sarah. People who can stand up to bullies." "The world needs fewer bullies," Sarah corrected. "But I understand your point." The young mother had been listening quietly from her table, her child now forgotten in his high chair. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I saw what those men were planning, and I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. But you protected all of us." Sarah looked at the woman and her child, seeing in them all the innocent people she'd spent years fighting to protect. This was why she'd joined the military in the first place, why she'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, why she'd pushed herself through training that broke stronger people. "That's what we do," she said simply. "Those of us who can fight, we stand between the wolves and the sheep. It's not a choice, really. It's just who we are." Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "So what happens now? Do we call the police?" "Those men committed assault." Sarah considered the question. "I could file charges, but It might raise questions about my background that I prefer not to answer. Those men got the message. They won't be back, and they'll think twice before they target someone else. But what about you? Dolores asked. Will you stay in Cedar Falls? That was the question Sarah had been dreading. She'd built a life here, modest as it was. She had an apartment she liked, work that satisfied her, neighbors who'd become friends. But she also knew how small towns worked. By tomorrow, everyone would know what had happened at Murphy's Diner. The story would grow in the telling, becoming more dramatic with each repetition. I don't know, she admitted. I came here to disappear, to become someone normal. After today, that's not going to be possible. Frank reached across the table and patted her hand with surprising gentleness. Sarah, I've lived in this town for 47 years. I've seen good people and bad people, heroes and cowards. What you did today wasn't about being abnormal. It was about being decent. You protected people who couldn't protect themselves. That's as normal and right as anything gets. He's right, Dolores agreed. You might not be who we thought you were, but you're exactly who we want you to be. Someone we can count on when things go wrong. Mike Rodriguez stood up from his table and walked over to the booth. Ma'am, I've got 3 daughters. The oldest one is 16, and she's starting to date. After what I saw today, I'm wondering if you might consider teaching some self-defense classes. There are a lot of women in this town who could benefit from learning even a fraction of what you know. The suggestion caught Sarah off guard. She'd never considered sharing her skills with civilians, but the idea had merit. If she was going to stay in Cedar Falls, and that was still a big if, she'd need to find a way to integrate her true self with her civilian life. That's actually not a bad idea, she said slowly. Though I want to focus on practical self-defense rather than combat techniques. There's a big difference between protecting yourself and what I was trained to do. Could you teach us the thing you did to that guy's wrist? Tommy asked eagerly. That was incredible. Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had since the confrontation began. That's exactly the kind of technique that could seriously injure someone if used incorrectly. But there are simpler things that can be just as effective in the right situation. As the conversation continued, Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in months. These people weren't afraid of her despite what they'd seen. If anything, they seemed more interested in being her friend than they had when they thought she was just a quiet graphic designer. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe being true to herself wasn't incompatible with the normal life she'd been seeking. Maybe Cedar Falls could be home to Sarah Martinez, the former Navy SEAL, just as it had been home to Sarah Martinez, the graphic designer. The only way to find out was to stay and see what happened next. Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls, just as Sarah had predicted. By the next morning, her phone was ringing before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. The caller was Mayor Patricia Hoffman, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been running the town with quiet efficiency for the past 8 years. MS. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling so early, but I think we need to discuss what happened at Murphy's yesterday. Sarah had been expecting this call. In a town of 12,000 people, news of a confrontation involving 3 strangers and one of the residents would reach the mayor's office within hours. She'd spent most of the night wondering if she'd have to pack her bags and find somewhere else to disappear. Of course, Mayor Hoffman. Should I come to your office? Actually, I was hoping you might meet me at the community center. There's something I'd like to show you. An hour later, Sarah found herself standing in the gymnasium of the Cedar Falls Community Center, looking around at a space that clearly hadn't been used for much beyond youth basketball and the occasional wedding reception. The hardwood floors were scuffed but solid, and the room had good natural light from windows set high in the walls. Mayor Hoffman was a compact woman with graying brown hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd dealt with her share of difficult situations over the years. She watched Sarah examine the space with obvious interest. Frank Murphy called me last night, the mayor said without preamble. Told me what really happened at his place and what he learned about you. He also mentioned Mike Rodriguez's suggestion about self-defense classes. Sarah nodded, but didn't respond immediately. She was still trying to read the situation to understand whether this conversation was heading toward acceptance or expulsion. Ms. Martinez, Sarah, I want you to know that this town has no interest in judging you for your past. We all have things we've done that we don't talk about over coffee. What matters to me is what happened yesterday and what it tells me about who you are now. The mayor walked to the center of the gymnasium, her footsteps echoing in the large space. 3 men came to our town with bad intentions. They targeted a woman they thought was vulnerable in a place where our people go to feel safe. You stopped them without anyone getting seriously hurt, and you made sure they understood they weren't welcome here. She turned to face Sarah directly. That tells me you're exactly the kind of person we want in Cedar Falls. The kind of person we need. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. She'd been preparing for rejection, for the polite but firm suggestion that she might be happier somewhere else. Instead, she was hearing acceptance, even gratitude. I appreciate that, Mayor Hoffman. But I should warn you that my presence here might attract unwanted attention. People with my background sometimes have enemies. Do you have reason to believe someone is looking for you specifically? Sarah considered the question. No active threats that I'm aware of. But the work I did made enemies, and some of those enemies have long memories. The mayor nodded thoughtfully. Then, it sounds like having someone with your skills in town might be a benefit rather than a liability. Which brings me to what I really wanted to discuss. She gestured around the gymnasium. This space sits empty most of the time. The basketball teams practice here twice a week during the season, and we host the occasional community event, but that's about it. I've been trying to think of ways to make better use of it, to offer programs that would really benefit our residents. Sarah was beginning to see where this conversation was heading. Mike Rodriguez wasn't the only person who called me last night, the mayor continued. I heard from 6 other people who were in the diner yesterday, and at least a dozen more who heard about what happened. The common theme was that they'd all like to learn some of what you know. Self-defense classes, Sarah said. More than that. Physical fitness, situational awareness, basic emergency response. The kinds of skills that could help people protect themselves and their families. We've got everything from single mothers to elderly couples to teenagers who could benefit from that kind of training. The mayor paused, studying Sarah's reaction. The town council would be willing to hire you as a community safety instructor. Part-time position, decent pay, and you'd have complete autonomy over how to structure the classes. You could continue your graphic design work, but you'd also be doing something that uses your real expertise. It was an opportunity Sarah hadn't expected, and she found herself genuinely intrigued by the possibilities. Teaching self-defense to civilians would be very different from her military training, but it would let her use her skills for something constructive rather than destructive. What would you expect in terms of curriculum? She asked. Whatever you think would be most useful. I'm not going to pretend I know anything about this kind of training, but I do know that we've got a lot of people who feel vulnerable, especially women living alone or elderly residents who worry about crime. Sarah walked around the gymnasium, mentally mapping out how the space could be configured for different types of training. The possibilities were intriguing. Basic self-defense could be taught to mixed groups, but she could also offer specialized classes for different demographics and skill levels. I want to start with awareness and prevention, she said, thinking out loud. Most dangerous situations can be avoided if you know what to look for and how to respond appropriately. Physical techniques would be secondary to situational awareness. That makes sense. What else? Basic fitness. You can't defend yourself effectively if you're out of shape. Nothing extreme, but enough to build confidence and practical strength. The mayor was nodding approvingly. What about those 3 men yesterday? Do you think they'll be back? Sarah shook her head confidently. No, they learned something yesterday that they won't forget. Men like that are cowards at heart. They only pick fights they're sure they can win. After what happened, they'll find easier targets somewhere else. Good. Though I have to ask, are you sure you want this? Teaching civilians is probably very different from your military experience. Sarah considered the question seriously. Her military training had been about neutralizing threats with maximum efficiency. Teaching self-defense to townspeople would require a completely different approach, focusing on de-escalation and escape rather than elimination. It would be different, she admitted. But maybe that's what I need. A way to use what I've learned for something positive instead of just trying to forget it all. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah and Mayor Hoffman worked out the details of what would become the Cedar Falls Community Safety Program. Classes would be offered 3 evenings a week and Saturday mornings, with different sessions for different groups. Basic self-defense for adults, specialized classes for teenagers, and general fitness programs for seniors. Sarah would start with a small group of volunteers to test the concept and refine her teaching methods. If the program was successful, they could expand it to include more advanced topics like basic first aid and emergency preparedness. By the time Sarah left the community center, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. For the first time since leaving the military, she had a purpose that felt meaningful, a way to be herself while still building the normal life she'd been seeking. The first test would come that evening. Frank Murphy had volunteered his diner as a meeting place for anyone interested in the new safety classes. Sarah would introduce herself properly to the community, explain what she could offer, and see who was willing to trust their safety to a former Navy SEAL with a past she couldn't fully discuss. She spent the afternoon preparing, not just for the meeting, but for the possibility that her quiet life in Cedar Falls was about to become much more public. Word of the safety classes would spread beyond the town's borders. People would start asking questions about who she was and where she'd learned her skills. Some of those questions she could answer. Others she'd have to deflect or redirect. But for the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Sarah wasn't planning to run from scrutiny. She was planning to stand her ground and see what kind of life she could build with her real skills and her true identity. The woman who walked into Murphy's diner that evening was neither the mysterious former operative nor the quiet graphic designer. She was Sarah Martinez, community safety instructor, ready to help the people of Cedar Falls protect themselves while finally finding a place where she could belong as her authentic self. What she didn't know was that her decision to stay and teach would set in motion a chain of events that would test everything she'd learned about combat, community, and the sometimes fine line between the two. The 3 men from yesterday had been a minor threat, easily handled. What was coming next would require all of her skills and more. But that was still days away. Tonight, Sarah had a classroom full of neighbors who wanted to learn how to protect themselves, and for the first time in months, that felt like exactly where she was supposed to be. The transformation from invisible resident to community leader was just beginning, and Sarah was ready to see where it would take her. After years of missions she couldn't discuss and victories she couldn't celebrate, she was finally fighting for something she could talk about: the right of good people to feel safe in their own hometown. It was a mission she could believe in and a battle she intended to win. 3 weeks after the incident at Murphy's Diner, Sarah's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The community safety program had started with 12 nervous volunteers and had grown to over 40 regular participants. Word was spreading to neighboring towns, and she'd received calls from as far away as the state capital asking about expanding the program. The classes themselves had exceeded everyone's expectations. Sarah had discovered that teaching civilians required a completely different skill set than her military training, but it was one she seemed to have a natural aptitude for. She learned to break down complex techniques into simple, repeatable movements that ordinary people could master with practice. More importantly, she learned to read her students' needs and fears. The teenage girls who came to class were worried about different threats than the elderly couples or the single mothers. Each group required a different approach, different techniques, and different reassurances about their ability to protect themselves. The success of the program had brought unexpected benefits. Sarah found herself becoming genuinely integrated into the community in a way that her 18 months of anonymity never had. People who'd barely acknowledged her existence before were now stopping her on the street to thank her for the classes or to ask questions about safety. Mrs. Chun had started bringing her homemade cookies during her weekly visits to the bookstore. Mike Rodriguez had invited her to his daughter's quinceañera. Even the mayor had asked if she'd be willing to join the town council's emergency preparedness committee. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere. But she also knew that her past had a way of catching up with people, no matter how far they ran or how well they hid. The reminder came on a Thursday evening in late October, while Sarah was teaching an advanced self-defense class to a group of 12 women who'd been training with her for 2 weeks. They were working on escape techniques when her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. The message was simple and chilling. Found you. Sarah finished the class without letting her students see her concern, but her mind was racing through possibilities and contingencies. Only a handful of people knew her real identity and background, and most of them had no reason to track her down after all this time. After her students left, Sarah locked the community center and walked the 6 blocks to her apartment, taking a route that let her check for surveillance while appearing to move casually through the familiar streets. She didn't see anything obviously suspicious, but that didn't mean much. Professional surveillance was designed to be invisible. Her apartment showed no signs of intrusion, but Sarah went through it room by room anyway, checking for anything out of place. Her emergency bag was still hidden behind the false panel in her bedroom closet, containing cash, fake identification, and the few weapons she'd kept from her military service. For a moment, she considered using them. It would be simple enough to disappear again, to reinvent herself in another small town where no one would think to look for a former Navy SEAL. She'd done it before when she'd first left the military, moving 3 times before settling in Cedar Falls. But as she looked around her apartment at the graphic design awards on her wall, the photos from community events, the thank you cards from her students, Sarah realized that running wasn't an option anymore. Cedar Falls had become home in a way that nowhere else ever had. These people were her people now, and she wasn't going to abandon them because of a threat from her past. The decision to stay meant she needed more information about what she was facing. Sarah opened her laptop and sent carefully worded messages to 3 different contacts from her military days, people who would have access to current intelligence about former special operations personnel. The response came faster than she'd expected. Within 2 hours, her secure email contained a message from Colonel James Harrison, her former commanding officer, who was now working in Pentagon intelligence. Sarah, glad to hear from you after all this time. Sorry to say your instincts are right to be concerned. Marcus Volkov is out of prison as of last month. Federal witness protection couldn't guarantee your safety, so they didn't notify you officially. But my sources say he's been asking questions about former team members. Be careful. Jim, Marcus Volkov. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight of old fear settling in her stomach. Volkov had been a Russian arms dealer operating in Afghanistan during her second deployment. She'd been part of the team that captured him after a firefight that left 4 of his men dead and cost Sarah's team 2 good soldiers. Volkov had sworn vengeance against everyone involved in his arrest, but he'd been sentenced to life in federal prison. The fact that he was now free meant either he'd made a deal with the government or something had gone seriously wrong with the justice system. Sarah spent the rest of the night researching everything she could find about Volkov's release. The official records were sealed, but her contacts were able to provide enough information to paint a disturbing picture. Volkov had been released as part of a prisoner exchange deal, swapping him for 3 American agents captured in Eastern Europe. The man who'd sworn to kill her and everyone on her former team was now free and apparently well-funded enough to hire professional trackers. The text message proved he'd found her location, which meant Cedar Falls was no longer safe, not for her, and potentially not for anyone associated with her. Sarah's first instinct was still to run. She could be gone before morning, leaving nothing behind but apologies and unanswered questions. But as she considered her options, a different plan began forming in her mind. Marcus Volkov was expecting the Sarah Martinez he'd known 8 years ago, a soldier operating under military rules of engagement constrained by laws and regulations and the need to bring enemies back alive for interrogation. He wasn't expecting a civilian with nothing left to lose and an entire community to protect. The next morning, Sarah called Mayor Hoffman and requested an emergency meeting. She explained the situation in general terms, without revealing classified details about her past missions or Volkov's identity. What she could tell the mayor was that someone from her military past had found her location and was likely planning to cause trouble. "How serious is this threat?" the mayor asked. "Serious enough that I'm considering leaving town to keep everyone else safe," Sarah replied honestly. Mayor Hoffman was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. We don't abandon our people when they're in trouble. What do you need from us?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected to be told that she should leave for everyone's safety, not offered support to stay and fight. "Information," she said finally. "I need to know if any strangers have been asking questions about me, checking into hotels, or making inquiries around town. This person will probably use hired help rather than coming himself." "I can do that. What else?" "I need you to spread the word that the community center will be closed for the next few days while I handle some personal business. I don't want anyone accidentally getting caught in the middle of something dangerous." "Done. What about you? Do you have backup? People you can call for help?" Sarah smiled grimly. "I have some resources, but mostly I have home field advantage and 8 years of training that this person is probably underestimating." Over the next 48 hours, Sarah transformed her apartment and the surrounding area into a carefully prepared battlefield. She mapped every entrance and exit route within a 6-block radius, identified defensive positions, and cached emergency supplies in 3 different locations. The plan was simple. Let Volkov's people find her, then take them down quietly and efficiently before they could threaten anyone else in town. It wasn't a perfect strategy, but it was better than running and leaving the community vulnerable to retaliation. The confrontation came on Saturday night, 2 days after Sarah had suspended her classes. She was walking home from Murphy's Diner when she spotted the surveillance team. 2 men in a rental car parked across from the bookstore where she lived. They were professionals, but they weren't expecting their target to notice them. Sarah continued past her building and around the block, then approached from behind using the network of alleys and fire escapes she'd mapped out days earlier. The first man never saw her coming. Sarah appeared at his window like a ghost, her hand already reaching for the pressure point at the base of his skull that would render him unconscious in seconds. The second man had just enough time to reach for his weapon before Sarah was through the passenger door and applying a blood choke that dropped him without a sound. Both men were carrying professional equipment, night vision scopes, military-grade communications gear, and weapons that definitely weren't available to civilians. Sarah zip-tied their hands and searched their belongings, finding confirmation of what she'd suspected. Marcus Volkov had hired a professional extraction team to bring her back to him alive. The intel she gathered from their equipment told her everything she needed to know about Volkov's plan. He wasn't just seeking revenge. He was planning to use her as bait to draw out other members of her former team. Cedar Falls wasn't the end destination. It was just the first stop on a much larger campaign of vengeance. That changed everything. Running away wouldn't protect her community. It would just delay the inevitable while putting her former teammates at risk. The only way to end the threat was to go straight to the source. Sarah called Colonel Harrison and requested an immediate extraction. Within 6 hours, a helicopter landed in the field behind Cedar Falls High School, and Sarah was on her way to a secure facility where she could plan her response to Volkov's threat. But before she left, she made one last stop at Murphy's Diner. Frank and Dolores were there despite the early hour, having received Sarah's call asking them to meet her. "I have to go away for a while," she told them. "There's a problem I need to solve before it gets worse." "How long?" Dolores asked, her grandmother's instincts already knowing this might be goodbye forever. "I don't know. Maybe permanently. The person who's looking for me won't stop until one of us is dead. And I can't let that fight happen in Cedar Falls." Frank reached across the table and gripped her hand. "You do what you have to do, but you remember that you've got a home here when it's over. These people need you, and not just for the safety classes." "They'll be fine without me," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. Maybe, Dolores said, "but we don't want to be without you. So you handle whatever needs handling, and then you come back to us." That's an order from someone old enough to be your grandmother. Sarah hugged them both, probably longer than was strictly necessary, then walked out of Murphy's diner for what she hoped wouldn't be the last time. The helicopter was waiting, and beyond that, a confrontation that would determine whether Sarah Martinez could ever truly leave the past behind. As Cedar Falls disappeared below her, Sarah looked down at the lights of the town that had become home and made a promise. She would end Marcus Volkov's threat permanently, and then she would come back to the people who'd given her something worth fighting for. The quiet graphic designer was gone forever, but Sarah Martinez, community protector and former Navy SEAL, was just getting started. And Marcus Volkov was about to learn that some people are much more dangerous when they have something to lose than when they have nothing left to protect.